In this lecture, we're going to take a look at some important factors related to human behavior that can have an effect on various measurements taken for research purposes. And when we think about behavioral measures, these various behavioral measures, can also include physiological measures, and we'll see some examples of that here shortly. Different types. There are three main types of behavioral measures. The first is referred to as behavioral trace, where a measure of human behavior relies on evidence left behind by a participant who is no longer present. And so this would be reflective of a historical type of approach when evaluating, for example, the workplace setting. And so examining human behavior or patterns in human behavior by an employee or a supervisor who is no longer around, that despite not despite not being around, has left an influence that affects that workplace setting and people's behaviors. And so when we talk about behavioral trace, it's really examining the effects left behind in a more historical or measuring things in the past. Behavioral observation involves the researcher making a direct observation, directly seeing that particular type of behavior. And this is very common within the educational setting, sometimes in the clinical setting as well. So, with the example of an educational setting, researchers might sit off to the side and directly observe children playing and noting particular patterns that may emerge. And so in this particular example with behavioral observation, it's just that the researchers are not interjecting themselves into the situation that they are observing. They're just making simple observations. And behavioral choice is one in which, as the term suggests, participants will make a purposeful selection from a number of options. And so this table here, I won't go through all the different elements in this table, but this is a good table to review that summarizes the three main elements or the three main types of behavioral measures. In behavioral trace, where that measure has been left behind by a participant that's no longer present, behavioral observation and behavioral choice. And so we're looking at the past, the present with observation, and some element moving in the future as the person makes a choice as to what group or what category they would become a part of. Other considerations when making research measurements from participants includes what's called participant reactivity. And in this case, we need to be aware that people do act differently or unnaturally because they know someone is watching them. And that's what's illustrated here on this photo. Here we see a person undergoing an exercise test and they're being measured for physiological variables. However, this person is fully aware that there are others around watching them, and that fact may cause this person to change their level of effort in order to satisfy the fact that they know they are being watched. And so, from a research perspective, researchers should strive to minimize participant reactivity as it may cloud the primary research question, the primary objective of the study. In terms of unobtrusive measures, these refer to strategies that allow for observation and assessment without the participant's awareness. So we don't want to obstruct a natural behavior that a person may exhibit. However, we do need to be aware of intentional deception. And so this is something that typically research ethics boards will review. So if there's any question from a research perspective in terms of deception that might be used in a study as whether it may be unethical or not, then the Research Ethics Board at the institution will evaluate policies and procedures in order to determine if that experimental technique is violating a participant's rights or not. A serendipitous observation is one in which the researchers are not primarily looking for and is an unexpected finding. And so serendipitous observations are not to be ignored. In fact, oftentimes these unexpected outcomes of an experiment can actually lead the researcher or the research team down a new path of study. In terms of the outcome or the outcome variables or the dependent variables, behavioral measures, we'll take a look at four different types of measures here. Behavioral measures are those that assess a person's behavior, and this can be evaluated through the three different methods: trace, observation, or behavioral choice that was outlined a little bit earlier. In terms of attitudinal measures, these refer to measuring a person's feelings towards a particular topic, and this can be evaluated through surveys or questionnaires by posing questions or statements to those potential research participants or to the actual research participants. In terms of cognitive measures are those that measure the assessment or measure or assess a person's mental ability, and so evaluating a person's ability to recall information or measuring a person's intelligence would be a cognitive measure, and that's illustrated here with this what's called the short-term memory test for people between for kids between kindergarten to the 12th grade. And this is one published by the University of Washington, where children would view certain images and try to recall those images in order to evaluate their memory. In terms of physiological measures, these are assessments that will evaluate a biological characteristic. So some examples of a physiological measure include a measurement of heart rate, the galvanic skin response, or taken collectively in what we see here as the so-called lie detector test. So a test administrator would ask a series of questions, and by measuring the galvanic skin response, which applies a very small electric current across the skin, and if the person with the idea that if a person is lying, that will be reflected in these electrical measurements taken across the skin, as well as being reflected in their breathing rate and their heart rate as well. One other item to make note of here when it comes to measurements includes what's called the floor and ceiling effects. And the floor and ceiling effects, as the term suggests, refers to the upper and lower limits of possible ways to quantify some observation. And so one common scale that is used in exercise is what's called the perceived exertion rating scale, and that's what we see here on the left hand side. And so in this research study, research participants were performing an endurance type of exercise, and during the period of that exercise, as they began to fatigue, the participants would rate their level of perceived exertion, where on the scale a 6 indicated no exertion at all. That's what they experience when they're not exercising, and extremely hard exercise would indicate a value of 19, and they could provide a value just above 19 as well. On the right hand side are the data obtained from this one research study that evaluated people exercising out to their maximum level. So along the x-axis, what we see here is exercise expressed as a percent of each person's maximal duration. And as we see, as they exercise longer and longer, the rating of perceived exertion approached the higher end of the scale. But notice at the very beginning we have this curve, this nonlinear increase, and at the very end we start to see that the responses start to plateau. In fact, the error bars are greatest in the middle as opposed to at the very beginning and the very end. And that's what we see here in terms of a ceiling and a floor effect with various measurement scales. So in this case, a ceiling effect refers to the upper boundary of a measurement tool. So with the perceived exertion scale, the upper measurement boundary would be the 19. The ceiling effect occurs if the upper bound is set too low. And at the very top end of the scale, the participants begin to run out of options in order to express the level of exertion that they're experiencing. In terms of the floor effect, it's the opposite, where the lower boundary of the measurement tool at the very bottom is set too high. And so once again here, we see that at the very bottom of the scale, so at the level of 6, there are very few options that participants can select in order to capture their level of exertion with this type of exercise. And so these two facts do not necessarily invalidate the use of the scale. In fact, this scale has been validated in over decades of research, but it's just to make the researchers aware that every scale, every measurement tool does have inherent limitations. And so by understanding those inherent limitations, researchers will be better able to make use of these various measurement scales. So this ends this lecture, this video, on evaluating behavioral measures.